Hola amigos, bienvenidos de vuelta a Warcraft Classic Hardcore, versión aniversario y wea. Vamos a continuar con nuestro viaje de Rogue, aunque hoy quería cambiar un poco las cosas y reaccionar por lo menos a un video antes de empezar a transmitir, mejor dicho, antes de empezar a jugar. Entonces los invito a tomar asiento un minuto aquí en el IN en esta soleada tarde veraniega de Soleis. No muy cómodo estoy, Julián, pero bueno, es lo que es. Estoy seguro que puedo subir a esa web. En fin, este es un buen lugar. Entonces, como les iba diciendo, vamos a reaccionar a un video, así que vamos a asegurarnos que las cosas estén apropiadas. Este amigo se llama MentisWave. Aquí está su canal. No puedo dejar de recomendar este one. Sé que en inglés, así que no espero que todo el mundo entienda. Voy a hacer lo posible por explicar, y creo que algo vale la pena explicarlo, pero más que nada voy a dedicarme a ver este video de 13 minutos junto con ustedes. Vamos a ver si hay algo con lo que no esté de acuerdo. En este video el hermano está básicamente explicando la naturaleza de este engendro llamado Vaush, que por si no lo conocen, voy a simplemente hacer un Google al respecto y vamos a ver qué es lo que Google nos dice de este animal. Edad 30 años. 14 de febrero del 94. 188. Acerca de Ian Cornish, mejor conocido como Vaush, es un youtuber en el pasado streamer de Twitch estadounidense de tendencia izquierda. Su contenido trata sobre política, actualidad, de una perspectiva socialista libertaria. Socialista libertaria. En otras palabras, woke. Ha participado en numerosos debates, bla bla bla, bla bla bla. Socialismo gay es el futuro. Better no Bush is American left wing. Esto es básicamente la representación de lo que es el epítome del left wing americano zurdo woke gringo auto odiador. Libertarian socialist, etc. Ultra feminist. Word only advocate for transgender rights. Word only. Ok. Ya. En este punto, mi conocimiento sobre este imbécil es súper limitado. He visto dos o tres de sus videos hace tiempo. Me dieron cualquier cáncer anal. Mentira, weón. No me dio cualquier cáncer anal. Simplemente cierto cringe, weón, y cierta como sospecha, weón, de cierta malicia interna. No sé, weón. Se veía bastante desquiciado, weón. Puedo por lo menos decir eso. ¿Cuántos seguidores o números tiene este weón? 29K. Este veniste. Puta. Hay que ver su YouTube. Visto la duda. Ah, 500K. Ya. Es un weón con seguidores. Y aquí tenemos al pequeño David. Pequeño David. 87K. Veamos qué tiene que decir pequeño David de señor Goliath. Señor Goliath Vaush.
As a good portion of the people watching this video may already know, a gentleman by the handle Doomerpolitics has released what is quite possibly the most comprehensive, well-researched, and meticulous takedown of a
Ok, Doomer Politics. Dejarlo ahí como pendiente. Pero básicamente este hermano está en una hora y media, una hora 40 minutos argumentando porque este weón es básicamente maligno. Ni siquiera así como es tonto, no, es maligno. Otro pequeño David.
bread tuber that the interwebs has ever seen. I was planning on making something similar about Vaush myself at a later date, but honestly, I now feel like I no longer need to. The deed has already been done, and done very well. However, the main point of this video is not some random shoutout, but rather to discuss an alternative conclusion, which is the possibility that, rather than being just unironically evil, Vaush is simply unironically a midwit. Don't get
A Midwit. Midwit es básicamente un palurdo. No sé cómo traducirlo, ¿vale? Básicamente un idiota educado. Como yo lo traduciría en una palabra, no sé, pero un idiota educado. Un idiota que pues, sabe leer, sabe escribir, sabe articular, pero no deja de ser idiota. Como que su postura en la vida es ser idiota. Que su propósito no es como una wea no intencional. Puede ser que una persona sea idiota porque no le queda otra que ser idiota. Bueno, eligen la idiotez.
get me wrong, Doomerpolitics did a fantastic job, and I agree with him on 99% of what he said. He fully exposes how Vaush regularly lies, supports political violence, makes up non-existent data on the spot, presents fringe views as if they are unanimous.
Ya, este web básicamente prueba que este otro compadre, Vaush, regularmente miente. O sea, no es que sea una wea que de repente se equivoca, no, regular y consistentemente miente. Soporta la violencia política. ¿A quién le recuerda a este weón? Yo lo único que creo es que se parece muchísimo a mi presidente, weón. Y yo creo que es la razón en la que este tipo de arquetipos de sacos de wea hay que echarles un ojo, weón. Que son peligrosos, weón. Make shit up. Básicamente mentir, pero mentir dos. Mentir rango 2. Fringe ideas positioned as gospel truth. O sea, ideas ya tremendamente inexploradas, weón. Sin sentido alguno, weón, pero sin contenido real. Siendo empujadas como el mismo evangelio, weón, la santa verdad. Esa es otra característica de estos weones que, si bien son anticristianos, si bien son tremendamente anti-Dios en general, sus posturas siempre se resuelven a créeme porque yo sé que tengo la razón. ¿Y cuál es tu razón? No, créeme nomás. ¿Vale? Es como otra, otra forma de decir fe, pero bien macabra. Ten fe en esta weá que te estoy diciendo yo. Porque sí. En fin.
Accepted truths, commits numerous reasoning errors, and often falsely paints his debate opponents as white supremacists.
Ya, ese es el otro. Siempre por delante el supremacismo blanco. Esas son las cartas, weón. Aquí en la política de mi país, todas estas malandras, toda esta basura, es básicamente su mandamiento. Esa es la otra weá, weón. El supremacismo se ocupa para fabricar el Strauman. Y así seguir postulando mierda, weón.
If you have not already seen it, you should absolutely watch it. It's pure gold, and a link will be in the description below. But for now, let's get into the meat of this video. There is an old saying that you shouldn't attribute to malice what can be explained by ineptitude, but don't rule out malice. And while I definitely do not rule out the possibility that Vaush could indeed be as bad as others are stating,
yo creo que siempre hay una mezcla entre malicia y tontera, weón. Hay weones que son puramente maliciosos y cero tontos, weón. Hay weones que son al revés y así y así. En fin, weón, siempre hay una mixtura, pues tampoco es que la weá sea fija, pues, los weones pueden ir evolucionando también en el tiempo, pues, pueden ir acrecentando su malicia. Y puta, weón, el diablo sabe por qué viejo se hace, pues, weón, y entre más viejos se hacen estos weones también van creciendo en intelecto, pues, lo que complica las cosas porque hace que generen bicicletas más y más pajeras, po, más y más complicadas de entender y bueno, desenteretejer, para explicarle al otro por qué son pescas.
some of the things he has said, after all, are pretty indefensible. I believe that the conclusion that Vaush is a midwit may be more accurate. So what is a midwit? For those who don't know, the term midwit is a bit of a meme. It refers to a phenomena where people on opposite ends of the intellectual spectrum agree on something, with the person of average intellect in the middle disagreeing. Now, it's important to point out that there is absolutely nothing wrong with having an average intellectual ability. What makes a midwit is specifically when an average person attempts to overcompensate and make themselves out to be a greater intellectual than they actually are, leading to them kind of making an arse of themselves. In other words, a poser. They will often do this by actions such as as falling in line with the groupthink of academia, overanalyzing simple concepts that do not need to be deconstructed, using uncommon vocabulary in a superfluous manner to make themselves appear more educated, arguing semantics, and going along with whatever the consensus is over how people believe in intellectual.
Siempre que un culiao te argumenta sobre semántica, es como cuando una mina te habla del horóscopo. Y ya vos sabéis que bueno, está perfecto. Voy a ir a buscar algo para tomar y seguimos. Lo peor es cuando tenéis políticos que argumentan sobre semántica, weón. Cheto madre, weón. Y aquí tenemos de todos esos, weón. De todos esos. Ya están aquí. Toda esta mierda ya está aquí instaurada, weón. Son el futuro. Vienen todos de ñuño, hermano.
Intellectuals should act. The big problem is that midwits tend to be obsessed with the optics of being an intellectual more
Eso, tan obsesionados con la estética de ser intelectual. Le encanta la idea de lo nerdo, pero solo de una forma muy superficial.
so than factually being correct, and this makes midwits extremely susceptible to certain errors in judgment that deal with consensus, such as appeals to authority, bandwagoning, false dichotomies. They also tend to drift towards social shaming tactics, such as cry.
Los buenos se arman con las mismas falacias, weón, donde sea que anden. Appeal to authority, ad hominem, that one, black or white. Using an opinion or a proposition of authority figure in an institution and authority place of factual argument. No alcanzo a leer el resto, pero básicamente porque en ley está bien. Porque la autoridad me apaña, puedo hacer lo que quiera, básicamente. Bueno, era la dominante, esa weá, si no la conocen, váyanse a la chucha, weón. Black and white. Bueno, eso es poner posturas culiadas contrastadas y obviar todo lo que haya entre medio. Y el backwagoning es apelar a la popularidad de lo que sea que les guste a los culiados en el momento, ya sea cortarse la pija, meterse weas por el culo, weón. Toda esa mierda degenerada casi siempre. Los furros, toda esa mierda.
Bullying and race gender baiting. All of these issues lead the midwit into pitfalls where they fail to notice certain things that would, in a twist of irony, be obvious to them if they were not constantly performing mental gymnastics. Hence why the midwit often objects to facts that even people of below average intellect can discern. The TLDR of it is that a midwit is basically a pseudo-intellectual. They aren't necessarily stupid, they just aren't as smart as they would desire you to believe. So now let's take a look at some of the things that Vaush has actually said and see if he fits the midwit mold. First off, does Vaush use false dichotomies? Yes. In his debate on critical race theory, he commits the extremely common reasoning error that significant disparities between racial groups can only be indicative of environmental or genetic reasons, and that any environmental factor must be racism. This is erroneous because many environmental factors, such as culture, religion, and the differing traditional values or various nuances of the world that come with them, are based on free choice. Anyone spouting this nonsense is thus forced via reductio ad absurdum to argue.
Eso es verdad en todos lados, menos en World of Warcraft. Aquí todos sabemos que los trolls somos una minoría oprimida por la realidad. En fin.
That free will is somehow
Oprimidos por los escritores de Blizzard, en verdad, weón. Son ellos los que nos tienen cagados, weón. Son los verdaderos demiurgos de esta weá, pero en fin.
racist, which of course would be ridiculous. I could probably spend another 10 minutes on why the disparate outcomes argument doesn't work, but instead let's move on. Does Vaush use appeals to authority? Yes, he does. And not even going to bring up an example on that one, just watch almost any one of his debates and you'll see that happen. But furthermore, Vaush has a degree in sociology and regularly brings it up. He's pretty proud of it, I guess. Well, about that. A study on Harvard University revealed that sociology professors are over 5 times more likely to be full-blown Marxists than others. And if they aren't Marxists, they are often at least leftist radicals in some sense. This makes sociology classes have an unfortunately high likelihood of being an echo chamber for bandwagoning onto progressive representations of economics, which is very bad despite the fact
Esa wea es cierta para todas las universidades, weón. Hoy en día están todas coartadas por esta mierda, weón.
that sociology courses are not actually counting as an economics class. That's not the field it's supposed to be in, but it wheels its way in anyway. While this doesn't prove conclusively that Vaush is simply regurgitating what he has been indoctrinated with, it's definitely good Vegas betting odds. It would also provide a good alternative explanation for why Vaush argues in bad faith and spreads disinfo so often. People who have been indoctrinated with Marxist dogma often exhibit a combination of belief bias and in-group bias. Basically, if it confirms our beliefs, then it's true, we are good, everyone else bad, therefore everything we say is good even when it isn't true. Does that make sense?
Básicamente dogma. La cruda realidad del zurdo en su esencia más corpórea y al mismo tiempo esencia pura, weón. Son teístas, weón, pero son teístas de la mierda, weón. De la caca. En el fondo son teístas, ateos
No,
teístas.
that's the point. Whether this type of thinking is evil or just stupid is...
Ese es el dilema, weón. ¿Son malvados o son estúpidos? Como yo creo que es una combinación de ambas, weón. No excluyente que haya weones que sean pura maldad o pura estupidez, po, pero
is something that can be debated endlessly. Does Vaush use social shaming tactics? Yes. Vaush does this so often that it's even in the title of some of his videos, such as his debate with Carl Benjamin. Of course, if you actually watch the debate, into about an hour in, it turns out to be more of an argument over semantics, since Europeans and Americans tend to use the term ethnic differently, making the exchange an inconclusive examination of what Sargon actually believes. And yet, Vaush throws this accusation
nuevamente semántica. Cuando un weón empieza a discutir semántica contigo, ándate. Chao. Ándate. Así. No.
Sí.
Pregúntate. La persona con la que estoy discutiendo tiene 5 años. Ya ahí podéis discutir semántica. Después de esos 5 años ya. Bueno.
into the video title anyways. Yeah, this is yet another extremely common...
Ya el buen de 5 años no discutís semántica con él, lo educáis en semántica. Básicamente. No podéis discutir semántica, solamente podéis educar semántica. Paren de discutir semántica, por favor, no discutan semántica. Que es este cáncer. Everyone I don't like is Hitler. Básicamente, es el adómine preferido de estos buenos.
reasoning mistake among Midwits. Because Midwits often argue emotionally, they often seem to unironically believe that demonizing and dehumanizing counts as a refutation of their opponent's argument, when it obviously does not. Does Vaush...
Esa es la weá. Tiran el adómine y juran que van así campeonando.
put a greater focus on optics over factual accuracy. Yes, indeed, this is actually one thing Doomer Politics' video covers quite extensively. However, one thing I need to point out to add to it is a video Vaush did on how he would build socialism. It's about 25 minutes long and can be summarized as Vaush believing that focusing on optics is the only way he feels that he can get his Marxist ideas eventually turned into seats in Congress. In other words, it's not so much evidence that Vaush is being malicious, but more so evidence that Vaush just isn't able to think of any better ideas. This video is also a good example of taking way too long to explain what is actually an extremely simple concept. Should it really take 20...
Las pajas, pues las pajas, estos jóvenes les encanta gusta pajearse con marxismo, weón, no paran así, darle vuelta a la pierna, weón, y la weá, ¿qué de más que? Dejemos que este compadre lo explique, weón, porque no es más que tú no podías explicar el marxismo en menos de 2 minutos, weón, ya. Está malo todo lo que dijiste, weón.
55 minutes to hyperanalyze and explain what is essentially build our idea by grassroots support and slowly shifting the Overton window more towards accepting Marxian economics? No, it does not take that long. Now next up is the question of Vaush's morals. Obviously I couldn't talk about whether Vaush is better considered a pseudo-intellectual or evil without going into ethics. This is where things get tricky. Similar to Doomer politics, I too had a hard time assessing what the heck Vaush uses as a basis for his morality. Roughly half a year ago I tried watching through some of Vaush's videos that had anything to do with ethics and couldn't really find any consistent universal principle.
Por esa razón es que me dio cáncer realmente ver los videos de este weón. Su inconsistencia es tan flagrantemente egopática, weón, que hace imposible, weón, consumir su mierda.
Vaush does seem to view morality as something that primarily exists in the box of authoritative power structures, but even then, he applies a different morality to his advocation of socialism, which is that he seems to believe it will result in a net benefit of the majority of people, therefore it should be implemented. So the combination of these would place Vaush somewhere between stage 4 and 5, more leaning towards 4 on the moral development scales of Lawrence Kohlberg. This brings us to our first problem. Conventional morality is basically normie morality, something you would expect from someone who hardly thinks about it. Social power structure says X good, therefore X good, or says Y bad, therefore Y bad. It's a fairly straightforward way of thinking about the world. While this form of thought might work for the average Joe, the issue here is that Vaush is trying to position himself as something much more than the average Joe, as someone who is trying to be a major spokesman for modern progressive thought. I would expect a much more post-conventional morality model, which encompasses most of the more complex ethical models you can research out there. But Vaush is simply not at this level. Nowhere in this is more apparent than the fabled "The Debate Vaush Doesn't Want You to See" philosophy PhD student versus Vaush video. Now, the interesting thing about this debate is that the fact perspective philosophy largely agrees with Vaush on the idea that capitalism is bad.
Por supuesto. Son la misma calaña.
But that doesn't matter. And it seems to actually work against Vaush. This is because Vaush gets to now talk
Ya, creí que no estaba.
freely about how he feels a socialist ought to act without having to defend socialism along the way. And oh my, does he not have a clue. This particular debate has already been deconstructed elsewhere on the internet, and anyone with Google Foo can find plenty of info on it. So I'm not going to go too far in detail here to reinvent the wheel of what's already been said, but I will instead just clip out the most ridiculous part.
Being a socialist just makes him aware of his moral responsibilities. The capitalist is doing the wrong thing because capitalism is wrong, and they are perpetuating that system. But being a socialist, if you are given the power of a capitalist, you should seek to subvert the system by doing what is right.
Sure, I mean, you can say that, but I can never say that an action is morally negative if it doesn't decrease the total utility in the world. Now, you could argue that a socialist would, could expect more from them. And I think I would agree with that, because I've said that to people in my community. They say, Vaush, I'm a landlord, Vaush, it just came into some money, etc., etc. You try to give them good takes. But that's not me saying that this is now morally obligatory behavior, because to do so would be to suggest that I would impugn a person for engaging in an action which carries no negative utility, which would be a disruption of what I believe.
That's not true.
To understand how completely insane this is, imagine if there was a kitten torturing factory, and you were to somehow come into ownership of this factory. If you are like any normal sensible person, the first thing you would do would be to obviously shut this factory down and liquidate its assets. But according to Vaush's strange take on morality here, the person in power has no moral obligation to do anything, as allowing the kitten torture chamber to keep running wouldn't decrease or increase the amount of suffering in the world prior to you taking ownership of this factory, so you don't have to do anything. Now, if I were put like that, I'm pretty sure Vaush actually would understand the need to shut this factory down. I suspect what's really going on here is that Vaush is just failing to follow perspective philosophy's reasoning. Or to put it simply, Vaush has absolutely no idea what he's talking about. So this brings us back to the hypothesis that Vaush is a pseudo-intellectual poser, and that brings me to an alternative explanation for his morality that I think is much more accurate. Motivated reasoning, which in a nutshell is cherry-picking data that agrees with your views, then using whatever method you can pull out of your arse to prove it. Here's the conclusion. What evidence can we find to support it? You know, that kind of reasoning. This explains Vaush's methods towards ethics more than anything, such as
Vaush method. Here's the conclusion. As far as we find is supported. Todo, o sea, aquí tienen las conclusiones, los hechos y todo. En el marxismo.
in the Destiny debate over Kyle Rittenhouse. In Vaush's mind, the conclusion that Rittenhouse did bad is already in place because that's the left-wing talking position, and so Vaush must come up with whatever ethical justification he can think of in order to support this judgment without regard to consistency. This would also explain Vaush's insane response to perspective philosophy. They are arguing in the framework of utility, which given Vaush's position would make himself look like a hypocrite if he disagreed here, since Vaush himself engages in a lot of capitalist consumption. So instead, he just kind of makes up whatever rationale on the spot he can to justify himself, without actually understanding the implication of the words coming out of his own mouth. The term Politics uses for Vaush's ethics, metanormative nihilism, would thus simply just be another means to Vaush's end here, i.e. Vaush has said things that are very pro-violent revolution, and so he needs to adopt some fairly wonky principles to justify this, where truth and morality only exists when he wants them to. In conclusion, is Vaush evil, or is he just a twat? Honestly, it could very well be both. Being foolish isn't necessarily mutually exclusive to being evil after all, but I believe the term midwit is more sticking, better suited for him rather than just blurting out Vaush bad. The midwit label more accurately encompasses what Vaush specifically is, a pseudo-intellectual that gives the appearance of being interested in truth, the appearance of being interested in reason, when in
La apariencia, exacto. Es toda una fachada, todo un constructo. Los buenos se identifican como intelectuales, igual que la tragedia andante que tenemos hoy en día en el tema de género, pero en fin, eso ya es otro tema. Entonces, básicamente, travestismo intelectual, en fin.
reality he's just yet another
Such many cases, debo decir.
indoctrinated Marxist who will never admit it in the cases when he is wrong and will stoop to whatever is necessary to avoid such an admission. And Politics may even be considering this himself, because halfway through making this response, I notice he has changed the title of his video from Vaush is unironically evil to more of a question, is Vaush unironically evil? And that's probably for the better, it's probably a good change. I suspect without the ability to peer into Vaush's head and read his mind, no one could really know what the true motives really are. However, what it really boils down to, in the end,
Nadie sabe, pues es el último misterio que nunca se va a descubrir, pero las pistas están.
is that whether Vaush truly is ethically immoral and thus evil in a philosophical sense almost doesn't matter, because even if he was at heart a good man, his talking points are so basic, so predictable, and so easily refuted and so nonsensical that he wouldn't really be worth listening to. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, subscribe, and all that good stuff.
En fin, eso era lo que quería compartir con ustedes. No sé si ver el otro video, pero en fin. Voy a terminar este vivo acá. Y luego voy a empezar otro. Donde sí voy a jugar.